Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 102. With our book today, an essay publicly available almost everywhere on the internet that describes the underlying mindset of people who have been cowed by calcified totalitarian state power. This is a long essay, and we're going to kind of divide it up today on the show on the importance of holding on to individual conscience and holding that individual conscience pure, and also holding that individual conscience pure in the space of societal overreach, whether in a society that claims to be quote unquote free and democratic, but is not, or in a society that refuses to recognize its own growing tyrannical tendencies. This essay begins with a counterintuitive question and then sort of works backward through a whole series of answers. And this is one of the rare essays or books that we are attempting to cover more than once on this podcast. We actually covered this same essay in episode number 73 and tied it into conversations about Labor Day and the United Auto Workers. It stands alongside War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy and City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo. This is an essay that requires us to go back in and take a couple of different looks at it. So today we will jump back into The Power of the Powerless by Vaclav Havel. And we're going to be covering this essay today with our returning guest co-host, Libby Unger. How you doing, Libby?
I am fantastic.
So Libby just returned from a trip to India, and we were just talking about that before we hit record on this episode today. So she might be bringing some insights in from that trip to our conversation here today. She's also said she's a little bit jet lagged, but that's okay. We're going to guide her through gently through this. We're not going to pummel her too hard.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so we're going to gently guide her through The Power of the Powerless by Vaclav Havel. So I'm going to start off with The Power of the Powerless. We're going to begin in part 3 of the essay with this idea. And I quote, "The manager of a fruit and vegetable shop places in his window, among the onions and carrots, the slogan, 'Workers of the world, unite.' Why does he do it? What is he trying to communicate to the world? Is he genuinely enthusiastic about the idea of unity among the workers of the world? Is his enthusiasm so great that he feels an irrepressible impulse to acquaint the public with his ideals? Has he really given more than a moment's thought to how such a unification might occur and what it would mean? I think it can safely be assumed that the overwhelming majority of shopkeepers never think about the slogans they put in their windows, nor do they use them to express their real opinions. That poster was delivered to our greengrocer from the enterprise headquarters, along with the onions and carrots. He put them all on the window simply because it has been done that way for years, because everyone does it, and because that is the way it has to be. If he were to refuse, there could be trouble. He could be reproached for not having the proper decoration in his window. Someone might even accuse him of disloyalty. He does it because these things must be done if one is to get along in life. It is one of the thousands of details that guarantee him a relatively tranquil life quote, in harmony with society, unquote, as they say. Obviously, the greengrocer is indifferent to the semantic context of the slogan on exhibit. He does not put the slogan in his window from any personal desire to acquaint the public with the ideal it expresses. This, of course, does not mean that his action has no motive or significance at all, or that the slogan communicates nothing to anyone. The slogan is really a sign, and as such, it contains a subliminal but very definite message. Verbally, it might be expressed this way: I, the greengrocer XY, live here, and I know what I must do. I behave in the manner expected of me. I can be depended upon and am beyond reproach. I am obedient, and therefore I have the right to be left in peace. This message, of course, has an address C. It is directed above to the greengrocer's superior, and at the same time, it is a shield that protects the greengrocer from potential informers. The slogan's real meaning, therefore, is rooted firmly in the greengrocer's existence. It reflects his vital interests. But what are those vital interests? Let us take note. If the greengrocer had been instructed to display the slogan, I am afraid and therefore unquestioningly obedient, he would not be nearly as indifferent to its semantics, even though the statement would reflect the truth. The greengrocer would be embarrassed and ashamed to put such an unequivocal statement of his own degradation in the shop window, and quite naturally so, for he is a human being and thus has a sense of his own dignity. To overcome this complication, his expression of loyalty must take the form of a sign which, at least on its textual surface, indicates a level of disinterested conviction. It must allow the greengrocer to say, what's wrong with the workers of the world uniting? Thus, the sign helps the greengrocer to conceal from himself the low foundations of his obedience, at the same time concealing the low foundations of power. It hides them behind the facade of something high, and that something is ideology. We are going to talk about ideology, honestly, today on the podcast. We're also going to talk about, we're going to talk about the impact of Vaclav Havel's writing. We're going to talk about who he was. I am, even in reading this today, I am struck by how prescient and exact the words of Vaclav Havel are for our time in 2024 in the United States of America. I was just reading about the continuing, reading an article on Substack, interestingly enough, about the continuing progressive movement of politics through our previously politically neutral institutions of law and medicine. This is a real problem, even if you are a progressively minded person. And it's a real problem if you're a conservatively minded person, but it is a gigantic issue if you are neutral, if you are like the greengrocer who just wants to be left alone. I estimate probably in the United States, in any big corporation or any big institution, probably around 80% of the people working in there are apolitical. They're like the greengrocer. They just want to go along to get along, and they'll put up whatever sign they have to put up, and they'll say or mouth whatever shibboleths they have to mouth, and they'll do whatever it is they have to do to keep that check coming because they've got to pay the mortgage and the kid needs braces. But then there's that other 20 to 15 to 20% of folks. And that other 15 to 20% of folks, those are the folks, some of whom we're going to talk about today. Those are the folks driven by ideology. Those are the people who have engaged and have captured the institutions ideologically, from medicine and law all the way to our cultural institutions run by Hollywood and the press. We can see it everywhere. And yet, who will have the courage to stand up and point it out? Who will actually speak real truth to real power? The literary life of Vaclav Havel is something that we have to consider because he did come from somewhere. So Vaclav Havel the author of The Power of the Powerless, was born October 5th, 1936, and died December 18th, 2011. He was a Czech statesman, an author, a poet, a playwright, and a strongly anti-communist dissident. He observed the true heart of communism and the power that communism could wield in a formerly free society in the way that Milan Kundera did, or Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and other dissident writers. And yeah, I know Kundera came with his own baggage, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, well, the Russians don't really read him now because he didn't say nice things about Stalin, but they were dissidents. Havel wrote plays, essays, and memoirs, and contributed greatly overall to the development of Czech literature in his lifetime. And of course, he went to jail for it, which is how you know it was actual truth. He was a political prisoner, and his longest term was for 4 years between 1979 and 1983. Now, this is my bad. And it took me a long time to sort of separate these two men in my head because they both kind of did the same things. They were both dissidents. But I always used to confuse Vaclav Havel with his fellow dissident contemporary Lech Wałęsa, the Polish Lech Wałęsa. And he did share several traits of distinction with Lech Wałęsa, including the distinction of being arrested by communists for daring to open his mouth. Just as a side note, as things have progressed in the United States over the course of the last 20 years, and I've said before on this podcast, and I've said that it's the focus of what we're going to be talking about this year, I do believe that we are at the end of the fourth turning. I do believe that we are at a time when political jailing is definitely happening. And it has happened over the course of the last 20 years, most recently with some of the January 6th folks. Regardless of what you may think January 6th was, are we really a country that locks up people because they protest and they riot? Because if we are that country that locks up people because they protest and they riot, maybe we should have started with the people who were protesting and rioting in 2020 during that mostly peaceful summer. And maybe we shouldn't lock up people for pointing out such hypocrisies to the state. That's why we're reading this book on this podcast. That's why we're reading this essay today. That's why we're pulling this apart with Libby Unger, because I do think that at the end of the fourth turning, where I do believe we have reached the high watermark of a lot of this nonsense, we do need to embed solutions to this, because the next crisis that we have, and there will be another crisis, I am worried that my children, or maybe even my children's children, if they are so fortunate, may have to cast lots to figure out who's going to be on the top bunk of the gulag. And if you think I'm exaggerating, then you don't understand human nature at all. So with that, I'm going to turn to Libby. That's my initial thoughts on The Power of the Powerless. And we're going to go through this, and we're going to talk about, why does a person put a sign on their front lawn or post something on social media, which is our version of the green grocer's sign? Why do we do the things that we do in order to go along with the regime? And then, how do we get out of this? And I believe that there are many, many little pinpricks that we can use to bleed the state of power and to bleed propaganda of its power. And all it takes is all of us doing that work, using every single skill set we have. And I've often said before, I only do 3 things really good. I think good, I speak good, and I write good. I'm not a carpenter. I am not a plumber, and I couldn't paint a straight line if you paid me. Trust me, I tried in art school. But I do know how to do speaking and thinking and writing. And everyone, even the plumber and the carpenter, all the way up to me, has a responsibility to figure out where they stand in relation to truth and ideology and power. And more of us are figuring this out, I believe, here at the end of the fourth turning. So, Libby, I always bring you on when we're talking about like the real heavy books, the real heavy political stuff. And we'll get into some stuff later on during this season. But first, I brought you in for Roosevelt. Now I'm bringing you in for Vaclav Havel. So tell me what you thought of the essay, "The Power of the Powerless." What you think of Vaclav Havel? How his writing just struck you, and the impact of it on you? Because I sent you the link, and I don't know if you had any previous exposure to it. But yeah, sent you the link. You read it. Tell me what you thought.
I thought it was an incredibly easy read that a decade ago would have been mostly foreign from a contextual perspective, and really I would have been reading it with the lens of a historical period in time, specifically around, the rise of communism and, and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would not, even then, it would have been a lot of theory that I wouldn't be able to relate with any personal experience, which would have made it a more challenging read.
Mm-hmm.
But it just it flowed based on our experience for the last 8 to 10 years. I understand what ideology is in a way that I never understood before, and the impact of it. It's really not much different than religion, except I see ideology as really not having a moral code or a moral compass. The primary outcome of an ideology is continuation of power of those who are in power. One of the things that really resonated as I was reading the pages that you just read, that ideology is a specious way of relating to the world. It offers human beings the illusion of an identity, of dignity, of morality, while making it easier for them to part with all. Meaning that Vaclav Havel lived and believed about living in truth.
Mm-hmm.
And the concept of an ideology, especially in a totalitarian or dictator state, is the chasm between reality and the ideology is mind-bogglingly almost infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And so folks use the ideology to cover for the lies.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that you were giving the greengrocer a pass around putting up the sign because they were apolitical. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think it's, one of the things that we see in The Power of the Powerless is a discussion of folks, those who use ideology to control the masses require automation in response. So we have a lot of individuals who are not aware of what their human impulses are and why they're responding the way that they're responding. So the automation of putting up that sign, if it was to not be political, they would be aware of the lie that they're perpetrating. and why they're putting up the sign in order to preserve their status and safety in the overall system. So there's actually, stating I'm apolitical and I'm putting up the sign just so that you leave me alone suggests a level of awareness that I think 80% of the folks who are actually putting the sign up don't have. And I think we're at a place where a good 15% on the left, okay, I'll say 10% on the left, are in automation mode. They're not challenged by anyone around them, and they are so brainwashed into not believing anyone who challenges them that they respond reflexively. And that's why the media works for them and everything's working for them, is because they're on they're in autopilot. You do have the middle, that 80% that I always talk about. 80% of us are not having our needs met, and we don't know how. We're told that we have to choose the left or the right, and we don't want either effing one.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But we don't know how to fight the power. I don't believe that 80% is on autopilot. They just don't know how to fight the power. So some of them are silent, but they're not going to put up the BLM sign just to survive, right? The ones who put up the BLM signs are doing it on autopilot. There's the other 80% that aren't doing it, but they don't know how to actually fight the power. They just know it doesn't feel right.
The challenge of
so they know it doesn't feel right, and they know that survival, like they still have to pay their bills, and so they're looking for help for someone else to take on the fight,
right?
Because they're not willing to take it on, but they're also not willing to outwardly express support for the greengrocer, or I'll use Black Lives Matter signs as another example. They won't do that. They won't put the sign up, but they're also not saying anything out loud.
Right.
I lived in San Francisco for 20 years, or on and off for 20 years. I know how many people were silent when we were constantly, everywhere you went, people were spouting their politics, but they were the loud, like 5%. Everyone else was just silent.
So there's an idea here, and the author Rob Henderson just wrote a book about his experience as an immigrant, going to Harvard and Yale, I believe, is where he went, if I remember correctly. Just published a book about being a working class Asian immigrant, coming from a working class Asian family, and then going to Harvard. And his memoir continues an idea that Rob has been pushing for the last few years, which I think is a relevant one to our conversation here. And it's this idea of luxury beliefs, where the 1%, the elite, hold certain ideas about how the world should work or how the world can work, but they don't, and you've run into these people, they don't interact with anybody who lives outside of those boundaries. So they go from, I heard it framed this way. They go from, $100 a plate meal, in a limousine, to another $100 a plate meal in a limousine, and they never get out to talk to a barista who's making $14 an hour. They don't even know how to talk to those people. And so they are privileged. We talk a lot about privilege in our culture. There's two ways to view privilege. One way can be through the progressive lens of identity, as you were just saying, race, gender, class, whatever. But then the other way can be through the lens of belief systems, where you are privileged to hold belief systems that hold no consequence if they don't work out to you. Whereas if other people hold those same beliefs, they do hold a consequence to them that you will never experience. Case in point, for example, a luxury belief might be, I don't need marriage and family, or I can go sow my oats and I can either take the pill, or I can take the morning after drug, or I can get an abortion, and it doesn't matter because I'm going to marry somebody who's my equal status and wealth, and I'm going to have 2 kids afterward, and so it doesn't matter. Meanwhile, someone further down the socioeconomic ladder, um, who maybe can't afford to get an abortion or can't afford a morning after pill, but sees you role modeling this hedonistic sexual behavior, also seeks to role model that, and winds up with children all over the place that are illegitimate, terrible family situations, trauma, abuse, and so on and so on and so on. Rob points out that we see this everywhere with all kinds of luxury beliefs. And I just named a very broad one there that we can all identify. I want to relate that idea to what we're talking about here with the greengrocer. I am of the opinion that the greengrocer putting up the sign, that's privilege. It is the privilege to put up that sign. Now, it's an inverted privilege because it's the privilege of being inside of the state. It's the kind of privilege that Orwell was talking about when he didn't talk about all those people that were outside of the state. He only talked about, or didn't talk about the people that were inside of the state. He only talked about the people who were outside of the state, right? People who were resisting the state. That's where Orwell thought the real battle was. I think Havel thinks that the real battle is with the people who were inside and getting them out and pulling them out and getting them, because he talks about what happens when the greengrocer decides not to put up the sign anymore, when the greengrocer decides not to play with the system.
Well, the fact that he's putting it up is not privilege. It will give him privilege by putting it up, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I think the luxury beliefs, when I lived in Boulder growing up, we used to call them limousine liberals.
There you go. Yeah.
Same kind of concept, but the luxury beliefs are usually like the rich liberals who are married with 2 kids, who own property, who went to good schools, who have reasonable education, telling others that they don't need to get married, that there aren't benefits in having children, and then what we have is the loss of meaning in individuals' lives because they don't have a family structure, they don't have kids and all that type of thing. So they're spouting beliefs that they themselves do not live by, the
Right.
ultimate in hypocrisy. But, the intelligentsia think they know better. The same as like unions. California is trying to protect independent contractors by making it harder for, by requiring them to have the benefits that employees have, which means companies don't want independent contractors. They want to force independent contractors into being employees. Well, independent contractors want to be independent contractors because they want to dictate the way that they work, the hours they work, who they work for, how much they charge. And they don't want the benefits of employment, but the luxury leaders believe they know better about what will give you purpose and meaning and sense of empowerment in your life. And it's by being a slave to a corporation. So these are people who actually don't understand that there's a multitude of ways for people to live, as an individual and a family and a community, to work and create. They just have their one set of beliefs, and anything other than their beliefs are wrong. And that's where the effing arrogance that many of us repel against, reject, is because they only think it's their way or the highway. And, how many times have I listened to some of my liberal friends say, well, they just, they don't know what's in their best interests. Well, maybe you don't know what motivates them, what provides them with meaning. And because you don't talk to them or work with them or socialize with them, you have a judgment around how they get meaning, and it's wrong. So the luxury belief system is a full indoctrination around my way or the highway. And you either with us or against us. And this whole language, how we've been hearing for the last 4 to 5 years, actually since Hillary was running and called half the country deplorables, you're either with us or you're not. And when I was traveling on my India trip, I kept constantly, I was with a tour group, and I kept constantly feeling like people were trying to push me into a bucket. And I finally said, I stopped trying to think black and white about who individuals are. Just because I don't think like you means I think like someone else. No. Right? So that's where the cultish behavior of an ideology comes in, is they can't adopt ideas that are different from themselves. They have to reject ideas and people that don't think like themselves because they're so detached from actual human reality. And what we're seeing with the greengrocer is he or she is willing to sacrifice their principles in order to be given the privilege of running a business, feeding their family, etc. And I personally know from the pandemic how challenging the decisions are that individuals have to make about putting food on their table versus complying with state laws that are nonsensical.
So I have personal experience with that as well. Deep personal experience with that as well. And one of the things that I think is a knock-on effect from the way COVID was handled is that the people who are in that 80% group, the go along to get along group, and I know you say it's not that large, but I think
I think it is 80%.
I think okay, all right, I think it's huge. Yeah. The go along to get along folks. I think what shocked them the most, and this is the trauma. We talk about trauma in our culture. I think it's an overused term for a whole lot of things, and it doesn't apply. But here it does. The trauma of the decision-making process that had to happen on what are you going to sacrifice your principles. And I had conversations with people about this who were genuinely upset because you were being asked to sacrifice your principle here in exchange for a paycheck there. Matter of fact, I'm remembering a specific conversation I had with a specific person, and he genuinely did not know what to do because he had never, weirdly enough, even in the role that he was in, and it was a role where he needed to have strong principles for the entire 15 years he was in that role, but his principles had never fully been tested. Right. And so I think the trauma of the principle being fully tested has not yet fully gone out of the water. And this, you talk about sort of ideology and religion having similarities, right? I think that you are correct. But where the similarity lies the most strongest, and I know I'm making up that term, or lies the most strongly, is in the spiritual, not religious, but the spiritual results of where ideology and, quite frankly, where religion take you. And religion takes you, for all of its problems, and religion can be twisted into an ideology, don't get me wrong, for all of its problems, religion does take you in the direction of principles, whereas ideology takes you in the direction of sacrifice of your principles. And that is something else. And we saw that with real people. And I don't think, and this gets back to a conversation we consistently have on this podcast, I don't think that we were well equipped en masse. Even people who proclaim to be religious weren't equipped well en masse to deal with that sort of sacrificial decision at the moment of truth. And I can say that I dealt with it well at the moment of truth, but do I have regrets about the decisions that I made during COVID to not I'll frame it this way. The only reason I would put on a mask is because somebody personally asked me. But if the state is going to ask me, I'm not going to do it. The answer is no. If the greengrocer is going to ask me, I can go home. I don't need to go in your store. But if Bob, who I've known for 5 years, and I know what his heart is, if he's asking me, I'll do it for Bob. But I may not do it for Tom, and I may not do it for Jane. But for Bob, I'll do it. And that's how I parsed it. And when it came to the vaccine, when it came to the shot,
Yeah.
me and my house didn't do any of that.
Yeah.
And we continue to not do any of that.
Yep.
And we will continue to not do any of that. And that's just period. That's the end of the sentence. I will not be compelled. Well, that means, you know what that means? That means that you were going to have a reduction in your income by 35%. Fine, cool, check mark. You got anything else you got? Because you can't do, and by the way, with a guy like me, you can't do a deal with a guy like me. Right. You can't do a deal with a guy like me. And other guests who have been on our podcast before, DeRollo Nixon, he's the exact same kind of guy. Yep. You can't do a deal with a guy like that, right? So, but at the moment of truth, I think that's what rocked people. And it rocked them because the foundation of religion had been taken out from underneath our culture many, many years before.
I think there's one step further that, sure. And I too don't like the word trauma. I hate how our language has been bastardized, where words now have no meaning.
Yeah.
But to me, it was observing what our fellow humans are able to do so quickly.
Right.
And how quickly the status piece is to see what I thought were caring people to be domineering, like totalitarian in their thinking. Yeah. And it started early on with this was pre-pandemic, someone who was, said she could never vote for Trump because of what happened at the border. And she was, a single issue voter. And her single issues change all the time, just so you know.
Of course they do.
Because it's not a single issue, because she really isn't a critical thinker and doesn't know how to think beyond her ideology, which is, I'm a leftist. But, calling, anyone who voted for Trump evil, I was like, what? How is that even possible? Like, these people, and there's nothing evil about them, and using that language very easily and meaningfully. Then when you get into the pandemic, people calling for no healthcare for people who didn't have the vax, like the hypocrisy, the hypocrisies that, we kind of took for, that we would observe over our decades of life experience. Like, they were just thrown at us on a new level every week. These are not principled people who are they're not well-intentioned. Their principles are not well-intentioned. And that's where, when the hypocrisy is there left at right after right after right after right. And you're just like, where are the principles that you operate your life on? That's what was missing. And what became so obvious is that they're willing to kill someone who will not take a shot that has never passed FDA approval, and it's 30 years of being tested and now is okay. You can't ask for statistics on it, because if you do, then you're not with us. It's just like all reason is shot to hell. And I knew we had a critical thinking crisis, prior to the pandemic, but it came out in its full bore. And then, people saying you have a choice, and, even if you're to take it or not, you quitting your job is a reasonable choice. Now, that's not someone who is well-meaning in the use of that phrase, right? Like, you're forcing people to live on the street.
Right. Well, and now
Because they
we have,
won't live like you believe they should.
right. And now we have a situation, and you can go find these articles in the Atlantic. You can go find these headlines in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, which talk about credibility and principles. Good Lord. That paper shot to heck. The LA Times, the Wall Street Journal. You can go find these on popular websites like Vox and Aeon. Here are the headlines I am now seeing. Well, we should just forgive people for what happened during 2020 and move on. We should just forget. People just made the best decisions they could make during the time that they had
Yeah,
with the
Scott
information.
Galloway.
Right, exactly. Well, we should have some amnesty for all of the pro lockdown policy people or policy pushing and promoting politicians. Ooh, that's a lot of P's in there. And we should just move on. And I look at these headlines. I got to admit, I look at these headlines and I wonder what Vaclav Havel would have to say about all of that. And I think
we have a bunch of children, spoiled children, who are running our media, politics and country right now, and globe.
Yeah.
These are children who cannot admit they're wrong and are willing to give each other latitude
Right.
when it's convenient, but do not show the grace to others. These are just spoiled children.
Yeah.
But they own all the power institutions right now.
Right.
The reality is 80% of us saw all of these playbooks. We've seen them for 4 years now. All the games aren't working.
Right. And that's where we're going to go today. Yeah.
Right. And this is why the truth telling, like for those of us who are truth tellers who continue to tell the truth, like there are more and more people willing to be open to like the truth and like, oh yeah. So the question is, I'm framing the question for you.
Sure.
Are we at the end of the fourth turning? I do believe we are. The preference cascade is accelerating. Yeah, we talked about that concept a little while ago, but everyone is realizing that they're not alone in seeing these absurdities and feeling them, and they can now speak their truth. And then last week, it's not just bottom up; it's also top down. Yeah, the Palantir CEO, NVIDIA CEO, the Elon with his GFY statement, all of us are like, hallelujah, like we just need more folks who are saying that. And I also listen to Adam Carolla. Like, I love Adam and Dr. Drew.
Yes.
And and Dr. Drew's like, well, what do I say to these people? And Adam's just like, go F yourself. And it's just like, doesn't it feel great?
Right.
It's like, I don't know how to say that. I say it all the time when they tell me to do something I don't want to do. He's like, no, but like just go at yourself, right?
Yes, that's and that's the so on this show, I have people on as co-hosts with me, as guest hosts with me, who are of all political spectrums, all the way from like center left, far left, all the way to center right, far right. People in the middle, independent. I'm all over the map because books are books, right?
Well, and people are people. Like
people
you
are people.
Ideas from everyone.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. Like what Chris Cuomo is doing awesome stuff. Patrick Bet-David is doing awesome stuff. Right.
So I was just listening. I just listened to the episode of the PBD podcast because somebody else turned me on to that. And I had no idea who this guy was before like 10 minutes ago. And he's doing a daily show, like God bless him, or a 3-day-a-week show. Yeah. God bless him. I don't have that kind of thing inside of me, but I'm glad people do. And I listened to Chris Cuomo and Candace Owens, right? And I thought, okay, let's see where Chris goes with this. Let's just see. And what that means is what people are looking for at the end of the fourth turning is going to be contrition, consistency, and commitment.
Mhm.
Those are the 3 C's. So contrition,
Mm.
I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Consistency, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I will go forth and do this thing better, and then consistently do it in every single sphere where we can see you. Because now we all know how social media works, and we all know how the globo techno surveillance state works. We can all see you. So commitment, consistency, right? Those are the 2 big ones. And then a commitment, like I said, a commitment to truth at the end of that. Contrition, consistency, commitment. That's what we want to see. That's what I want to see from Chris Cuomo. I don't want to see a headline in the Atlantic telling me, just, give the kid a slap on the wrist. No, Justin Trudeau, you need to admit that you were wrong, because you were wrong. That young lady from down in New Zealand that quit her job as prime minister because she said it was too hard, Jacinda Ardern, who I then saw at a freaking World Economic Forum event floating around. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, you really wanted to get out of the work. And this is where it comes back to leadership. This is where it comes back to leadership for me. So genuine leadership is when you make a mistake, when you screw up.
Yeah.
Genuine leadership is based on those 3 C's: contrition, yep, consistency, and commitment. Those are the 3 C's that genuine leadership is made up of. And when we talk about adults in the room, the people who will be leaders at the end of the 4th turning and on the other side when we go into a new spring, the people who have demonstrated those 3 C's are going to be our leaders, and everyone else, I don't care how much power they think they hold or how many purse strings they think they can pull, will be ignored. You heard it here first. They will be ignored. It will be go F yourself. It will absolutely be that. It will be and actually I like Elon's second line that he said after this, which was actually even more impactful, and people forget about this. You're going to try to threaten me with money? With money? That's the correct answer. You're going to try to threaten me with my salary? With money? No, 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 no. Try again. That's the wrong lever. Oh, you're going to try to threaten me with my freedom? No, that's the wrong lever. Go back and try again.
Well, that's
the kind of confidence we have to have. That's the 4th C. That's the kind of confidence we all have to have, I think, moving forward. And that's what I think Vaclav Havel wants the greengrocer to have in The Power of the Powerless. Go ahead.
I agree. So at the end of the day, you need to be willing to walk alone. You need to be and you need to be willing to, at the end of it, be impoverished and in jail, to, stand up for what you believe in. Hopefully we don't go that far, but the Leviathan that is currently ruling the West will not go. I mean, it's already doing legal warfare. It's trying to bankrupt folks, through a variety of factors. So, it is doing all those things that a threatened institution will do. Absolutely. When it has no principles.
Absolutely.
So where I do think we're seeing the end of it. I think the next 9 months up to the election are going to be extremely hairy.
Yeah.
That being said, I have confidence that most people are, in that 80% have a sense of what at least some component of the game and aren't falling for it. Yeah. The reality is how many of us will move to that. You can take my job, you can take my home, and you can put me in prison. At least I have my dignity.
Right.
I know my truth and I'm not going to sacrifice it. It is easier to do it when you're in a family unit or when you're in a community, and then as an individual. And one of the things I think during the pandemic that they were really doing was trying to isolate us as individual, keep us from all those institutions that help us to be more committed.
Well, this is why also the states and the localities still matter. So
exactly,
this is a huge point that I'm going to bring up in July when we talk with DeRollo about the Constitution. It's actually going to be one of the center points because we'll be a little bit closer to the U.S. election. And I do think that our Constitution, it's a thin backstop, but it is the backstop. And The Constitution favors localities over states, states over federal power, and individuals over localities. That's where it comes down. And that's the other reason. I think so there's multiple reasons for the great move around that's still occurring in the United States. But I think the stronger spiritual reason is people are seeking to go where they can concentrate, in these pods of, I won't say resistance. That's even really it. It's these pods of, it's a space of principles. I think we got to keep going back to that word, where we share similar principles.
Similar principles. So I think one of the things when I was reading this on my trip, and I have some folks who are everyone else was from Seattle, the Pacific Northwest, and had lived there most of their adult lives. So they lived in a bubble, kind of like if you lived in New York City, you live in a bubble. And the one thing I thought was really interesting is when I pulled out the book, they were like, "Oh, that's really interesting. That sounds like that's probably a really great read." And what I took away from that is that the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc is still deemed by leftists as a good thing, especially, more traditional liberals.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they actually take this book and actually read it and can see themselves in it, I know that's really, really hard for those who aren't trying to stay intellectually honest. I've spent my life on that. So I know when I viscerally respond to something or say that's the other, that I need to check it. But I do think this is a good book to be saying, oh, that green grocer, who else, was I that? Was I looking for security and safety in the system? Did I ever check the truth? Because I think we have so many folks who are on autopilot and they don't even check their belief systems anymore. If you just shine a light on the behaviors, oh my gosh, I'm an automaton.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Like if I have this statement that I know a lot of folks don't like hearing from me much anymore, is everyone's thinking alike, no one's thinking.
Yeah.
And in a lot of the circles that I ran in 4 or 5 years ago, that was something that resonated with them. After the last 4 years, oh wait, if you're not thinking like me, then you're dangerous, baby. So how do we wake them up again? I think this book is really great from a possibility of waking folks up who are in the automaton mode, and then also empowering individuals who are like, do I really have power as an individual? Speaking truth. The butterfly effect.
The butterfly effect. Yes.
Okay.
All right. Back to the book, or back to the essay. Back to The Power of the Powerless by Vaclav Havel. We're going to pick up in part 9. Speaking of identity, the profound crisis of human identity brought on by living within a lie, and we already kind of brought this up, a crisis which in turn makes such a life possible, certainly possesses a moral dimension as well. It appears, among other things, as, and this is what Libby and I have been talking about, a deep moral crisis in society. A person who has been seduced by the consumer value system, whose identity is dissolved in an amalgam of the accoutrements of mass civilization, and who has no roots in the order of being, no sense of responsibility for anything higher than his or her own personal survival, is a demoralized person. The system depends on this demoralization, deepens it. It is, in fact, a projection of it into society. Living within the truth as humanity's revolt against an enforced position is, on the contrary, an attempt to regain control over one's own sense of responsibility. By the way, pause. I would update that word with a sense of accountability. Back to the book. In other words, it is clearly a moral act, not only because one must pay so dearly for it, but principally because it is not self-serving. The risk may bring rewards in the form of a general amelioration in the situation, or it may not. In this regard, as I stated previously, it is an all or nothing gamble, And it is difficult to imagine a reasonable person embarking on such a course merely because he or she reckons that sacrifice today will bring rewards tomorrow, be it only in the form of general gratitude. By the way, the representatives of power invariably come to terms with those who live within the truth by persistently ascribing utilitarian motivations to them, a lust for power or fame or wealth, and thus they try, at least, to implicate them in their own world, the world of general demoralization. If living within the truth in the post-totalitarian system becomes the chief breeding ground for independent alternative political ideas, then all considerations about the nature and future prospects of these ideas must necessarily reflect this moral dimension as a political phenomenon. And if the revolutionary Marxist belief about morality as a product of the quote-unquote superstructure inhibits any of our friends from realizing the full significance of this dimension and, in one way or another, from including it in their own view of the world, it is to their own detriment. An anxious fidelity to the postulates of that worldview prevents them from properly understanding the mechanisms of their own political influence, thus paradoxically making them precisely what they, as Marxists, so often suspect others of being, victims of false consciousness. The very specific, special political significance of morality in the post-totalitarian system is a phenomenon that is, at the very least, unusual in modern political history, a phenomenon that might well have, as I shall soon attempt to show, far-reaching consequences. We've talked about this quite a bit, so we don't need to rehash it, but just note a couple of things. From lawn signs to bumper stickers, the idea of socially norming our behavior towards what is acceptable and agreeable is how 20 years of the last social media has worked. Social media is our new lawn signs. It's our new bumper stickers. It's our new way of socially norming each other. Libby brought this up, and I agree with her. The lack of critical thought behind such social signaling, or even worse, the desire to shortchange such critical thought to venally profit from social signaling. By the way, I'm looking at you, Mark Zuckerberg, is a psychocultural phenomenon we are just beginning to wrestle with, I think, in the West. By the way, this is what concerns me about artificial intelligence, not the, and I'm going to use a dirty word here, so if you've got kids, you can skip over this part, you're listening to it, not the enshittification of everything on social media, as some popular tech writers have proclaimed that AI will do. It's not that. I'm not worried about that because that process is well down the road with human beings. What AI will do is it will ensure more conformity with social signaling, with the right thoughts, with the right ideas, because it will just do it in a way that will be automatic, in a way that will be soulless. But we won't need it because we'll be feeding that soulless food to people who are already automatons, who are already putting up those signs on their front lawn, and who long since abandoned critical thinking in themselves and in their children. Libby and I were just talking about this on her trip to India. The thing that resists this kind of social norming, the thing that Havel is talking about in that very short piece there, the thing that pushes back against this Marxist idea of demoralization, or demoralization via Marxist means, the thing that pushes back on all of that is cultural institutions, deep ones like churches, families, and communities. By the way, that's why, to paraphrase from Chairman Mao, in the long march through the institutions, that's where the demoralization had to occur in the West first. The critical question for us in our time, again, here at the end of the fourth turning, is how do we rebuild institutions in the face of rampant atomization and social norming? Now, here's an idea that I have. I'm seeing institutions start to get rebuilt. I'm seeing this begin to happen. It's not just with people moving around from blue states to red states or red states to blue states. I think that that's the social sorting that is happening. I also think that as institutions become more politicized, let's say legal institutions or hospital medical institutions, as they become deeply blue in a sea of red, I think it's not going to take too much longer, and it's already starting to happen in several different ways, for individuals and entrepreneurs in that sea of red to start going, maybe we need to do something else. Maybe we need to get together and start putting together our own foundations, start putting together our own AI, start putting together our own cultural institutions. You see this most sharply happening post-COVID in churches. So for those of you who are not religious or do not go to church or just don't pay attention to this, let me tell you what's happening. Every single church that closed or went online and closed during COVID, every single one of those churches is bleeding members right now in American culture. And do you know where those church members are going? They are going to churches that did not close during COVID. They are going to churches that may have closed for a short time, but then reopened quickly and did an online thing. They are going to churches that never closed during COVID, never did an online service. They are going to those churches. By the way, just so you know, those aren't churches that get surveyed by Christianity Today, which is another magazine that has been captured by leftist politics, in case you didn't know. Churches, families, communities. These cultural institutions need to be rebuilt, because this is the place where critical thinking and the kind of critical thinking that will lead to deep morals and a deep moral compass, this is the place where these things begin to grow. We are seeing this happen, but if you only pay attention to what's in your social media feed, if you only pay attention to what's on Google search, or if you only pay attention to what's in the news media, the dominant corporate news media, you will not see any of that. You won't recognize that it's happening. But it is happening. The process is beginning. People are starting to rebuild institutions, but it takes a long time. This is not something that happens overnight. This is not something that happens instantly, and it requires a moral as well as a lifetime commitment to do. But it is the only defense we have, I believe, against rampant atomization and a lack of critical thinking in our social norming. So, Libby, how do we rebuild institutions? Because you often say here, build for the good, right? I love that. Love it that you say that. How do we build for the good at a practical level? How do we unite? I think podcasts are one way that people are uniting, for sure. I think that's why podcasts are growing, because this technology is simple. With a voice, you can engage with another person, and then you can build out a whole bunch of other different things outside of that. I also see people practically engaging. I just talked about churches in homeschooling. I mean, the homeschooling movement, regardless of what you may think of it at a practical level about parents having the skill sets to be able to teach their children, homeschooling is exploding, and not just in deep red states either. People are opting out of the educational institution, which of course will leave the unfortunate victims, and I do use the term on purpose, the unfortunate victims of public school education will be left to be as they are. You're also seeing this in higher education. I think it's Brett Weinstein is involved with it, but yeah, Brett Weinstein and Barry Weiss of the New York Times put together the University of Austin, right? This is Jordan Peterson's putting together online courses with really smart people, and he's going to charge for a university degree and get it. Accreditation institutions who have also been captured by the left are starting to be ignored, and people are moving in different directions on this. We still do live in a dynamic culture, and it does sort of seem like you don't really see this kind of stuff until it actually pops up from the ground. But I do see it beginning to happen in various alternative spots. what are the practical steps to rebuilding an institution? Once you realize an institution is been captured, how do you get people together? How do you pull them out? How do you go off over here and say, we need to go build this thing? Because I know what I do. I know how I do it. I yell and I scream for a little while, usually 2 or 3 years. I get a bunch of people together and they go, well, somebody should do something about this. And I go, yeah, I'm already 10 feet down the road on you. Here's a plan I have written down. And then we go off and do the plan. And then I work on that for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, get it up, but get some legs up underneath it, and then move on to the next thing. That's how I do it. But maybe your mileage varies. How do we rebuild institutions? Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
I believe in outside-in transformation. So I was the co-founder and CEO of an ed tech company, and recognized that the systems that were protecting higher education were so strong that you couldn't change within those systems. You had to create from outside. And so how do you do that? You create and generate demand from outside the system, prove the concept, and then over time, the existing systems will change because customer expectations have shifted and their viability, the old legacy institutions' viability requires them to shift or die. Yeah. So, an example of outside-in transformation is what they're doing at UATX, University of Austin. That's a great example. The homeschooling is another movement outside in. Create demand, demonstrate what good looks like. And people, as with the new system versus the existing system, you create customer demand for those new outcomes because the legacy outcomes stink. And then it becomes that you get the flywheel effect where customer expectations shift. They shift at mass in the old systems, either adapt or die, and most will die a slow death because they don't want to change and they're so caught up in their way being the right way. Sound familiar?
Oh yeah.
But so UATX is a great example of that. One of the trends that I really like, I saw a headline the other day that people are opting out of like the big firms like McKinsey and Bain. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen Wall Street. People have opted, the smart people have opted out of Wall Street, but they've mostly gone to VCs and or that ecosystem. What you're seeing now are recent graduates actually going to the small business environment and either starting their own small business and or acquiring them. So it's what small business versus startup. Mm-hmm. It's about the sex factor. The startup is I'm VC backed. I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to exit and leave it for someone else, to carry forward. I don't really care about the business or the cash flows. I'm just building to exit. Small business. my words, is you actually are looking to generate positive cash flow to reinvest in the business, and you have a sustainable business model that doesn't require outside investors. You're creating jobs, based on organic growth, and you are your own boss because your only boss is the customer and your employees, and the community. So I love this trend on the small business. And so you might see people starting to invest back in the trades again. In the hard business, hard asset business versus soft asset business. And that to me is extremely promising on a lot of levels. One, hard asset businesses to me are a lot more real from an experience perspective. I think where you have people who believe that their thoughts are reality, live in this digitalized world where they're so detached from what it means to be human to understand real risk. I mean, it's why people wear helmets everywhere on bikes and skis, is because people are so risk averse. Just get a hard asset like a car wash or a plumbing business or something like that. You start to actually get in touch with it, what it means to be human, to create, to work with people, that the soul essence of life. And so I'm encouraged by that. But that to me is, we've got we got to start with decentralization of all industries, including government. And working on outside in transformation, breaking away from the legacy systems and building your own. One of the things early on in the pandemic one of the many things that had my heart breaking was the war on small business. To me, that was intentional, because small business is where people exist who are self-sufficient, empowered, and don't need the state. And everything that we saw from a policy perspective was designed to have you dependent on the state.
Well, you can compare that to what's happening currently, as of this recording, with the European farmers. I mean, the farmers don't need Macron. They can barricade him inside his castle and tear up the concrete on the Champs-Elysees and plant wheat on that sucker tomorrow.
So he and his husband are stuck in the house.
Careful. Now he's gonna
Sorry.
get us canceled. No. You're fine. Actually, I went down that rabbit hole a little bit the other day, and I thought, I don't know if there's anything there.
I don't know.
That's interesting.
I don't think there is, but I had to drop that in.
Right. Yeah, right. There is definitely, I don't know if there's that particular weirdness, but there is definitely some weirdness there. Anyway, but you see that with the European farmers, right? Who are on the march.
Truckers.
And the truckers, right, in Canada. You're also seeing this. I didn't realize this until a couple of days ago, but apparently 500,000 folks in Mexico City and various other cities in Guadalajara protested, get this, because apparently the president has proposed that voter ID and paper ballots at elections just go away in Mexico elections.
Ooh.
Right. And the question that occurs to me is, why cui bono? Who benefits in Mexico from that? Right. So you're starting to see people get together. People are starting to figure out what the game is. And we're going to cover this a little bit later on. But I want to get back to this idea of decentralization, because I'm writing about this in my book, my fourth book that I've got coming out hopefully at the end of this year. I'm writing some series of cultural commentary essays on all of these kinds of things, because I've been inspired by the types of folks like Vaclav Havel and St. Augustine of Hippo and Coleman Hughes and other folks. I've been inspired. So I'm gonna go down this road a little bit, gonna try my hand at some cultural commentary. But I write about this concept of decentralization. And so Paul Graham, the investor, I always go back to this. He always talks about, or he wrote an essay years ago, which I think was very prescient, about what he called it refragmentation, right? Where you have the centralizing system, which are the legacy systems, and then something like the internet comes along and defragments everything, But what happens is inside of all those fragments, things come back together and they start to make new concentrations of things. And Paul Graham doesn't always hit the target. There's several essays he's written where I'm just like, I don't know what you're thinking there, Paul. But that one really nails some of the dynamics that you've seen post-internet in the world. Because what the internet does as a connection machine is it allows that decentralization to occur at smaller and smaller and at more fragmentary levels, right? Between people. Okay. One of the things I'm obsessed with, particularly in America as an American, is our fourth branch of government, which never gets talked about, our administrative state.
Yes. Oh.
How do we decentralize that sucker?
You don't. You just kill it. Those are called, in the world of transformation and continuous improvement, non-value add jobs.
Like
they're make work functions.
Well, and I think this is what scares so many folks in the administrative state, or scared so many folks in the administrative state about your friend and mine, President Donald J. Trump, because he was the first candidate and first president in my lifetime that I can recall, other than maybe a Ross Perot or a Ralph Nader type. But I don't think Ralph Nader meant it. I think Ross Perot did mean it, but he didn't have the intellect to kind of get there. Trump meant it, and I think Trump has the intellect to get there. And he's the first politician in my lifetime who ever seriously discussed dismantling and smashing the administrative state. I think that is ultimately the reason for much of the, and the current term is lawfare, much of the current lawfare in which he is embroiled. The secondary effects are, of course, to drain him of cash and to make sure he can't go anywhere. But the primary driver for that is the fear that the administrative state has of this man. And it's an existential fear, because their existence is threatened by this person who actually means it. The
Leviathan is fighting for its life.
Right. Literally. Right. And what I've often said about President Trump is, regardless of whether or not you like him as a person, you can tell his political value by the reactions of other politicians and administrators to him, and their reaction says more about him than him himself, which is interesting, because when we think about how we rebuild institutions, we tend to want to go back to this idea, and again, Havel mentions it here, this idea of how do we address that moral crisis in society? This is what he first opens up with, right? The profound crisis of human identity brought on by living within a lie, a crisis which in turn makes such a life possible, certainly possesses a moral dimension as well. It appears, among other things, as a deep moral crisis in society. So we know we're in a moral crisis. And one of the big pushes against Donald Trump, of course, as a candidate and as president, and now as a candidate for president again, is that he is not a moral man. This was Mike Pence's problem with him. But to solve a moral crisis, number one, you have to identify what morality is. We can't even agree on that. Number two, you have to define what ultimate objective truth is. Forget that. That's out the window, at least for the time being. We're not going to get any consensus on that. I'm not going to get 51 versus 49 on that. The long march to the institutions worked too well on that one. But then the third thing you need in order to get that is you need a cultural machine that agrees that there's a moral crisis. And the cultural machine doesn't agree that there's a moral crisis. And so I don't know how you're going, right. So I don't know how you're going to get men of morals who have the courage of a Donald Trump. They do exist. They are there. I would assert they're in your small businesses. I would assert
Yeah.
that they are in your, some of them are on your school boards. They're the ones who are just barely holding back the stuff on the school boards. They are people who are your real estate agents who are looking at communities and seeing what is happening. They are people who are your local mayors. They are people who are your local sheriffs. They are people who are your local, even administrators in your local governments. I've met many of these people. Those are where your moral people are, who are going to solve this moral crisis.
I think there's many who can be inspired to
Yeah.
to
Okay.
hire to a higher purpose.
Right.
Uh, I personally agree that most of them are in, are entrepreneurs and in small business. You're predominantly because they're not driven by power.
Right.
They're not driven by the nanny state or being nanny staters. And one of the reasons why the left has been so effective, and even the far right, is because they are power hungry,
Yeah.
and they are driven by telling others how to live in a moral authority. And you've got the 80% who aren't driven by it telling others how to live. Yeah, they're driven by their family, by creating, by building. And there's such stink and noise associated with being in power, be it politically or business, that most people don't want it.
Yeah.
And so in a world where there is such a psychic consequence to be in positions of visible power, how do you actually drive change? And this is a thing that's I've been struggling with. And I know many others are too, whether you're center right, center left, libertarian, et cetera, is how, most of those folks are, don't tread on me, I won't tread on you. But we run the risk of the noisemakers. Nazis took over with less than 6% of the leaders.
Yep.
We've got 10% on either side trying to drive it. How do we do it? I always be like, be the light and show the way, and just show and be willing to lead. It doesn't mean you have to be against, an advocate against everything that's happening. You just need to demonstrate what good looks like. And when people see that, they gravitate to it.
Well, and one of the things that we kind of explored this in episode number 98, where we looked at the book True Grit by Charles Portis, a book about a young lady named Maddie Ross. This has turned into a couple of different films, one with John Wayne, and then recently with Matt Damon and Jeff Bridges. And the character Maddie Ross in the book, the young girl, she's a 14-year-old girl, and she kind of like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, she drives the narrative of the book. And me and my guest host, John Hill, were talking about how, because it's one of the things that strikes you about this book, and it was written in 1968. And so Portis writes this young female character, and she speaks from a place of religiously driven moral authority. And one of the points that we made during that podcast, I think it applies here as well, is that Maddie Ross in that book, just like Malcolm X, also in the 1960s, spoke from a position of moral authority based on their religion. That was what gave them the underpinnings. For Maddie Ross, for the character in True Grit, it was her, I believe she was Presbyterian in the book, if I remember correctly. And then of course Malcolm X was Muslim, right? And there is something that allows people to speak from that space of moral authority. And when you talk about power, fundamentally power is going to be immoral at the end of the day, because it has to be. It doesn't have a choice. It has to be villainous, because of just what it is. it's untrammeled force, right? Or at least that's the way I tend to think of power. Now, that untrammeled force can come in a lot of different fashions, but at a certain point, it's going to be turned, which is why, by the way,
it's going to always be attempt to be corrupted.
Right, which is
Right.
why the
And so
founding
that's
fathers wanted
why
to
the
put so many
fortitude
guardrails
it
around it.
takes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I would say Ray Dalio,
Yeah. Okay.
right. He has, first of all, there's no one who has moral authority because we are all flawed as humans. So
Right.
you cannot find, we can't rise someone to be in the level of God and virtuous.
No.
But, I do think there are examples of leaders who do have more of a moral authority, like a Ray Dalio. I would even say RFK Jr.
Mm-hmm.
is doing a very, very good job of showing how you can attempt to do the right thing in an environment that's trying to corrupt you to do the wrong things.
Yeah.
So I don't know that, power
Well, I
corrupts
think
those who are willing to be corrupted, but
I think I think both Ray Dalio and RFK Jr. And by the way, I retweeted that video that he did during the State of the Union address that he put out, and of course, my tweet said, "Why would the Democrat Party not want this man?" Dot dot
right.
dot 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 dot. Anyway, and just sort of just leave it hang out there for a little bit. I'll watch the video and figure out the answer to the question. But Ray Dalio and RFK Jr. and Matty Ross and Malcolm X. Okay, now we got to try a quartet of peaks we could talk about. I believe they fundamentally answered this question, which I think many leaders have to, particularly leaders at a local level. Where does your moral authority come from? Because you're right, we're not gods. We can't be that. We can't be that thing. Does your moral authority come from power, or does your moral authority come from authority and influence, or does your moral authority come from someplace else? And I think when we locate as leaders, when we focus the locus of our moral authority, not in power, not in influence, but someplace else, I think we're beginning to be on the path, I think, to something, to be able to make those decisions and step up and to lead.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, the goal isn't to be powerful or influential.
Right.
If you're to lead it from a moral place, so I always talk about from a business perspective, how am I weighing trade-offs to optimize for my customer, for my partners, for my employees, and for investors. And when you're making trade-offs so that all can thrive, in my mind, you're doing the right thing for the business overall, not just one stakeholder. When you become powerful and influential as an outcome of having done the right thing, that's great. What we see too much on social media and things that are supported and celebrated is those who seek power and influence alone, right? Not based on the outcomes of their work, but actually on their ability to proselytize and pontificate. So that's why I continue to say, focus on doing the right thing and be the light. That you may get power and influence that way. And it may, and this is a really important concept that came to me like 5 or 6 years ago, is that our most powerful influence are those moments that we aren't aware of. And it's the small moments and differences that we make in people's life. And so as long as you know what your intent is, as long as you know that you're working on doing the right thing for each of the stakeholders, you're not sacrificing your principles for one over another. You're making tough decisions based on a principled based belief system. Your influence can be indirect and direct, and it should never be the end goal. So as we think about how we influence and lead, the theme continues to be the same, which is just focus on doing good and and doing it and being of service to others, in a way that is builds them up and doesn't enable them, then we'll be doing the right thing. It's slow and it may not feel like you're making a difference, but the silent moments are the ones that are our most powerful ways of influencing folks.
Back to the book. Back to Vaclav Havel.
Very much, Libby. And now we're back to the book.
That was a good transition because I was going right where we were going. You did the transition perfectly. Thank you.
All right. Let's get back to the book.
Let's get back to the book. So we're gonna go to part 10 here, and we are, of course, jumping around in the essay. It's not a book; it's the essay. I would encourage you to go pick it up again. You can go get it. Oh gosh, they have it. You can get The Power of the Powerless. Oh gosh, anywhere on the internet. Just type in The Power of the Powerless essay. You can get the whole thing. But I want to talk about this concept of 1 million ants on the march by talking about a rock group called the Plastic People of the Universe. Great, by the way, rock band name. From Vaclav Havel. Undeniably, the most important political event in Czechoslovakia after the advent of the Husak leadership in 1969 was the appearance of Charter 77. The spiritual and intellectual climate surrounding its appearance, however, was not the product of any immediate political event. That climate was created by the trial of some young musicians associated with a rock group called the Plastic People of the Universe. Their trial was not a confrontation of two differing political forces or conceptions, but two differing conceptions of life. On the one hand, there was the sterile puritanism of the post-totalitarian establishment, and on the other hand, unknown young people who wanted no more than to be able to live within the truth, to play the music they enjoyed, to sing songs that were relevant to their lives, and to live freely in dignity and partnership. These people had no past history of political activity. They were not highly motivated members of the opposition with political ambitions, nor were they former politicians expelled from the power structures. They had been given every opportunity to adapt to the status quo, to accept the principles of living within a lie, and thus to enjoy life undisturbed by the authorities. Yet they decided on a different course. Despite this, or perhaps precisely because of it, their case had a very special impact on everyone who had not yet given up hope. Moreover, when the trial took place, a new mood had begun to surface after the years of waiting, of apathy, and of skepticism towards various forms of resistance. People were, quote unquote, tired of being tired. They were fed up with the stagnation, the inactivity, barely hang on in the hope that things might improve after all. In some ways, the trial was the final straw. Many groups of differing tendencies, which until then had remained isolated from each other, reluctant to cooperate, or which were committed to forms of action that made cooperation difficult, were suddenly struck with the powerful realization that freedom is indivisible. Everyone understood that an attack on the Czech musical underground was an attack on a most elementary and important thing, something that in fact bound everyone together. It was an attack on the very notion of living within the truth, on the very real aims of life. The freedom to play rock music was understood as a human freedom, and thus as essentially the same as the freedom to engage in philosophical and political reflection, the freedom to write, the freedom to express and defend the various social and political interests of society. People were inspired to feel a genuine sense of solidarity with the young musicians, and they came to realize that not standing up for the freedom of others, regardless of how remote their means of creativity or their attitude to life, meant surrendering one's own freedom. This was the climate then in which Charter 77 was created. Who could have foreseen that the prosecution of one or two obscure rock groups would have such far-reaching consequences? And then I'm going to move forward a little bit here. Such a conflict acquires, we're talking about the conflict with Charter 77. Such a conflict acquires a political character then, not because of the elementary political nature of the aims demanding to be heard, but simply because given the complex system of manipulation on which the post-totalitarian system is founded on, and on which it is also dependent, every free human act or expression, every attempt to live within the truth must necessarily appear as a threat to the system, and thus as something which is political par excellence. Any eventual political articulation of the movements that grow out of this pre-political hinterland is secondary. It develops and matures as a result of a subsequent confrontation with the system, and not because it started off as a political program, project, or impulse. This is an important point to understand in Vaclav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless. And this is what Libby and I have been talking about and casting around about for the last little while here. This is this concept of 1 million ants on the march. Now, in Havel's time, it was a rock group, right? Because rock music was considered to be, particularly by communists, an incredibly subversive form of music. By the way, the communists and the Catholics both held something in common on this, just pointing that out. Neither one of them were fans of the rock music because they realized what rock music actually is. By the way, Camille Paglia talks about a lot of this in her great book, which we will at some point cover on this podcast, Sexual Personae, a great, great book about the roots of meaning inside of art, which we actually need to think more and more about, particularly in a world of AI-driven art. We need to think about the roots of meaning. So when Havel writes about this rock group, and he writes about this rock group being prosecuted and the trial bringing people together and it acting as a locus point for political action in Czechoslovakia, what he's talking about is the propaganda arm of a totalitarian worldview beginning to crumble. By the way, that's happening in our time. From a January 24th, 2024 article on my favorite website, Zero Hedge, shout out to Tyler Durden and those boys over there, and I quote, in a 2022 Pew Research poll of U.S. mainstream journalists of all ages, over 55% said they don't believe all sides of any given story deserve equal coverage. The youngest journalists, ages 18 to 29, were the worst, with 63% saying they did not agree with equal coverage. Now that's interesting. But what's more interesting is this. In a similar poll, over 76% of the general public said they want equal coverage of all sides by the media. 76% of the general public want equal coverage. And yet 63% of folks working in the media ages 18 to 29 don't want equal coverage. They want to do propaganda in the service of justice or the service of cultural change. We've talked about this already, but there is a false belief that one person cannot make a difference in the face of injustice. And of course, there's also an equally false belief that one person alone can confront injustice and make a difference. The reality is that multiple people, decentralized and disconnected, but all sharing the same message, can make a difference. That's this idea of 1 million ants on the march. This is why alternative media, this is why platforms like Rumble, and yes, even X or Twitter or whatever it's calling itself now, right? The house that Elon bought. Increasingly, platforms like Substack and other places are allowing people in a decentralized fashion to share the same message. Maybe not necessarily comment on it with each other, may not necessarily act with each other, but we can see that we're not alone. And by the way, that's what happened with this rock group. We're not alone. These rockers are doing this. And if a bunch of, and I'm sure this was the thinking back in the 1960s, if these rockers, if these greasy kids can do it, why can't I? I think in America there's 1 million ants getting ready to start going on the march. Actually, I think they're already on the march. Generals without an army, right? That's where leadership is actually beginning to pop up. We've already kind of danced around this with the moral authority piece, but Libby, if you're seeing this happen right now, and you talked about sort of your perspective on outside in transformation, right? If you're seeing outside in transformation happening and you feel a pull towards leadership, how do you go over there and hook yourself up with those folks? How do you make that happen? Because I think people struggle with how to do that without it being false or fake or seeming self-serving. Or maybe I'm the only one who's ever struggled with this, because I see things happening and I'm like, I agree with what you guys are doing over there. I have zero skill sets over there, but I agree with what you guys are doing over there. I would love to be able to help you, but I have no clue what to do. I see this all
Ask, right?
right. And that typically that's my move, right? I'm like, I have no clue what to do, but I agree
Yeah.
with what you're doing here. What do you need? Right.
Yeah. I think it starts with that. I too, I'm at this place where, I see a lot of places that I want to touch into because I'm inspired. I see like-minded folks who are courageous in what they're doing. I also am repelled from, the toxic corporate environment right now. That's pretty dominant. So where you're seeing, hotbeds of courage and or good critical thinking, like I talked about Chris Cuomo earlier today. That the reason why I love what Chris is doing is he's actually exposing the game, and he's explicitly exposing the game. Like, so he is showing why we see hypocrisy in the statements that are made by either side. Why rational statements and rational solutions aren't created, why division is fostered. So he knows the playbook as an insider from a storied political family. He's he's an ex attorney, and he was also in the media. So, for me, I want to do more of what Chris is doing, or work with people who are doing more of what Chris is doing, what Patrick Bet David is doing by having those. Like, I love talking to him because he actually is, or not talking to him, listening to him, because he's super curious in other people's perspectives. So how do we start to tap in or help? First is just like ask, right? And maybe I don't know what the skills are, but neither one of us necessarily know what skills they need, but just start creating, create room for a conversation. Plant seeds. So what I actually hear from you when you say, I don't know what to do. I might have my own agenda. Oh, God forbid, and maybe we do have our own agenda, right? Our agenda is wanting to create good in a society. And I want to be a part of it. And you're doing something, and maybe I can help, or maybe I get a piece of it. But there's that. Oh, I hate it. I used to hate sales. I still hate sales. But it's I've just recently bought and sold a few cars, and the car sales process or purchase is just stinky. But by the time you've hit our age, we all know what the game is, and I can get less emotional about all of it, and I can kind of laugh at it. But sales has a bad name associated with it, but when you reframe it to like, hey, I've got something you might need, and and if you don't take advantage of it, it's your loss.
Right.
That, once it was that, and my whole identity isn't tied to whether the sale goes through or not, and it's more like it's your loss if you don't take advantage of it. It's a lot more fun, and you don't put this pressure on it, like having a negative, having an agenda or an outcome that's only serving of you.
Well, I think you also approach, and I've done it in this way too. I think you approach whoever's doing the thing that you agree with. Let's say you're in, I go off and I do my own stuff, right? Like I've got all kinds of different things going on, right? And And so I'm a starter by nature, right? Like I go and I see a problem and I go fix it, right?
Yep.
But if I see somebody else fixing a problem in a way where they have more bandwidth and more expertise, again, how can I help you, right? I think the easiest way to sort of approach that is with humility. I also think that if you're a person who is naturally a leader, or maybe even has developed the skill sets over time to be in a leadership position, or is traditionally in that position, I do think that leading from the bottom or leading from the back is critical. I also think that you have to have the ability, and I compare this to cleaning toilets, right? Like if I were in the civil rights movement in 1965, I don't need to be at the front. Someone's got to be cleaning toilets in the back. Somebody's got to be sweeping in the back. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talked about being the greatest street sweeper, in the history of the world. That way, when you go to heaven, you can be a street sweeper with the angels in heaven. Like you need that, right? Every organization needs people at every level, right? And so if I see somebody building something, I will tend to or at least I'll tend to recommend to folks, and I will tend to ask folks, what is the most undesirable thing that you don't want to do? And give me that. Because usually that's the thing that most needs doing.
So I tend to love the consultative sale. My background is is Deloitte. So
yeah,
part of the reason why that works is because I'm constant, I am a problem solver.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
But unlike a lot of sales folks, I have a solution. I'll find your problem that meets the solution. I'm more going in like, what are your problems?
Right.
Here's some ideas of solutions for you. So one is come to the table with an open ear to hear what the challenges are, and then offer solutions. And you don't always have to do that in your first call.
Right.
Second is leaders of big organizations somehow are allergic to doing work. And so, again, Deloitte, from partner to first consultant, we are always rolling up our sleeves and doing work. You lead, you partner, and then you support from behind. But doing work is you shouldn't be allergic to it.
Right.
How many people are allergic to doing project plans because somehow it's administrative? Like if you don't know where you're going, it's pretty darn hard to lead the crew, right? And
right.
sometimes you need to do your own project plan. Or maybe you need to, as a leader, take a day off and come up with the strategy. How are you going to compete to win and do the actual thinking? So what keeps you removed from employees, what keeps you removed from customers, what keeps you removed from partners is not understanding the work. At a, maybe at a conceptual level, but if you don't know how to do it anymore, it's really hard to lead from a place of authenticity. Right. And it doesn't mean that you have to implement a new software. It doesn't mean that you have to do a project plan. It doesn't mean that you have to wash the toilets. But sometimes you do. Mm-hmm. And, and we shouldn't be allergic to it. And also, what keeps us as leaders from trying new things is the fear of looking stupid. Mm-hmm. You know what? Be okay looking stupid. That's the only way that you learn a new skill. And with the way that the market is changing so rapidly right now, you constantly need to be looking stupid in order to stay relevant, stay relevant to your customers, to stay relevant to partners, to stay relevant to your employees. And if you're looking for a new job, to stay relevant to a new employer. So whole thing, offer solutions, be willing to do any work, and continue to be willing to look stupid. You said you like, what skills do I have to offer? Well, you may not have the skills, hard skills that you know about. I know my superpower is the ability to learn faster than anyone else. So I know how to learn in an environment very, very quickly. So I may not know something, but I'm going to figure it out really quick and faster than anyone else in your organization is currently doing it. So, learn.
Well, that's really good, because I was in education for many years. You built an ed tech startup. I think there's obviously, Mark Twain would say, there's a difference between education and learning. But I think that adaptability, right?
Yeah.
That necessity of being willing to grow wherever it is you need to go, is going to be really critical in the future, as we come out of this morass of nonsense that we are in, for future leaders.
Yeah, I mean, the mindset is always about adaptability, is about
Yeah.
being flexible and adaptive. And the only way you can do that is continually to learn.
Right.
So many people want certainty and they want a known outcome um, at the end of something. And you're not going to have either
Right.
in this,
Right.
in this environment. So um, we're talking about adaptability. An interesting analogy comes to play is I remember when Trump won in 16
Mm-hmm.
and people were crying because he won. And I'm like, what? I don't think I would have ever cried in my life because a politician won or lost. Like, it just is. And now I
Mm-hmm.
need to adapt and flex based on what the new reality is.
Right.
So, are you going to be a victim of circumstances, or are you going to just adapt based on what the new emergent reality is? And those who can adapt are going to succeed. And the adaptability comes from being able to read the environment, learn, and apply new solutions based on the existing environment. So if you can go reach out to any leader or any business, or individual with an open mind, what are the problems that they have? How can I solve for them? You will win in this game of life.
So we're gonna turn the corner here. I'm gonna wrap up a little bit. One of the interesting things about Vaclav Havel and Lech Walesa and other leaders of dissident movements is that they have attempted to, and I think that this is something that we're doing in the United States, but we don't want to use this word, because it's loaded still with connotations from the most recent unpleasant past in the last 80 years. But the thing that we are attempting to do, I think, at a core level, is we are attempting to build a solidarity movement. Now you need institutions, obviously, to do some of that, but you need institutions that are built outside of like we've been talking about, outside of the core crumbling centralized administrative legacy, all these terms we've used, institutions. And you need it in various spots, right? So you need it in media, you need it in culture, religion, politics, business, economics, all the way across the board, right? Particularly in a country as large and as dynamic as the United States. 315 million people. Even on our best days, we're not all walking in the same direction, not even close. And that's what makes this country a dynamic country and made us innovative and, to your point, adaptable. When innovative, adaptive our innovative and adaptive countrymen with that strain of DNA attempt to put together a solidarity movement, and this is one of the solutions to the problem, right? This is sort of us talking about solutions to problems. When we attempt to put together a solidarity movement, and you mentioned this earlier, the center left, the center right, and then the libertarians kind of are in a moment where it's like, no, don't anybody shoot anybody else, because we recognize we got this enemy over here. Don't anybody shoot anybody else. But we haven't really gotten to the point of solidarity yet. How do we click together a solidarity movement I think that is what people are looking for right now. I'm getting the sense in the zeitgeist that all it's going to take is not necessarily one leader, but a leader, maybe no, a few leaders with some infrastructure to really make this move. And this is where I believe that while Trump is the candidate currently of the Republican Party for president, I believe it's more close to say, or more accurate to say, Trump is the territory upon which this solidarity movement will be built, rather than the candidate or the leader of the solidarity movement itself, because he can't be that person. How do we put together a solidarity movement in the United States? A countervailing force.
I certainly hope that, I'll be honest, I certainly hope that he's not the place where the solidarity movement happens.
I think he's a territory. When I say territory, he's
I
built on, I just mean the positional sort of attitudinal approach. That's more of the territory I'm referring to. I don't necessarily mean him as a person. I mean the point he's staked out. Does that make sense?
Potentially. I think it's more in this. I think it's more in the center, more around like the. I'm gonna go to the RFKs.
Sure.
Right where it's the center.
Yeah.
I actually think Clinton did a really, really good job in the 90s trying to coalesce around the center.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, he actually did break down the welfare state for many years. You know, he did some things, because the left had lost their way. So he picked up the middle and did some really good things there. But the voices that I hear are less that are needed for the solidarity movement need to be less extreme,
right,
and less divisive. And the divisive voices I hear tend to always have othering, in it. And while Trump doesn't other bodies, he does a really disservice with the language around his distaste for individuals.
Sure.
And the language that we hear RFK use, and most people don't even hear it. Like, I'm so tired of the media because they continue to say, in the election we have two candidates running. Every poll is Republicans versus Democrats. Where are the independents?
Where are the independents?
80%? Right. Where's this? The RFK who has 25%. He's never mentioned in any of it.
Right.
So the coalescing to me needs to be with that 80% in the center, and it needs to be breaking through the media, the media and the political institutions that are forcing us into just this, the two parties.
The two-party silo.
How we coalesce around it. I do think there are voices. I'll bring back like a Cuomo. I actually think he's trying to bring us to the center. I think, PBD, he's a little too pro-Trump, for me, but he's still of trying to break the institutions down, which is important to provide a coalescing, feature. As much as I'm for the don't tread on me, I won't tread on you. I know I have to be pragmatic that we do need a center-led leadership and coalition to drive the solidarity, to drive a solidarity movement. I don't think it's the left or the right, because the institutions there are too strongly in favor of keeping the two parties alive. So how do we create a solidarity for the 80%? And that is outside of the existing political system. And it's, so like Tulsi Gabbard is another great centrist and voice. How do we create room and leadership for that to thrive? And that's what I struggle with. But I believe that the million ants are out there, and they're asking for something asking for something different.
Yeah.
Is it, so how we get there, breaking down decentralization of media, decentralization of social media, decentralization, bottom up building of businesses, and creating room for those independent voices that are willing to unify the center to happen. I don't think it's that. I think this, we have a false dichotomy of it being on the two, the left and the right.
Yeah. Okay. No, and you know what? When you explain it like that, I agree with that. I think that the revolution that should have happened in the Democrat Party with Bernie Sanders was strangled in its cradle. And that revolution should have occurred. If that revolution had occurred, 2020 might not have gone down in the way that it went
Agreed.
down.
Mm-hmm.
I think the revolution on the right has taken place in the way that it has. And so that party, the Republican Party in America, has been ideologically captured by Donald Trump. And that's just it, because that's what happens in revolutions. You take terror. That's what Malcolm X said. Revolutions take land. That's what they do.
Yeah.
And so, like, the land got taken. Okay. The center has not been taken for a whole variety of different reasons. But I think the biggest reason is that coalescing around a particular, not personality, but a particular set of, and what we've been talking about, principles or ideas, or even just
values,
right, or even just postures towards the world, right?
Yeah.
Has yet to take place. Tulsi Gabbard is very, very interesting to me. I've watched her for quite some time. I think she's highly independent and also highly Hawaiian. So that's also, you have to put those two things together and kind of sort of rock with that. Remains to be seen how serious RFK is, and we'll see this by his selection of whoever it is he picks for his running mate. We'll see how serious he is on that. I think he's dead serious. But then you have to sort of look at who he picks and what that sort of signals. I also think that it's not just politics, right? I think there's these centers everywhere. So law, medicine, the media. It's interesting for us to focus on politics and the media because those are the big sexy ones, but there's all these unsexy spots too that need to be captured. The ideological center needs to be captured in these places.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into the three branches of the government. The judiciary is a challenge. That will take years to work through. San Francisco is seeing the challenges right now. It got rid of its progressive DA, but it's still got a lot of progressive judges. So it's going to take a while to bring a little sanity to the institutions, all of those institutions. But if you can break through the media, then you have like the fourth estate back that will help to break down a lot of these other institutions. We need to break down big business and bring back antitrust regulations. So that we don't have the power center and money of the government and media being also led by big business. When was the last true antitrust case that you saw? I think most the last two generations don't even know what that is.
Maybe Microsoft, but even I think that was a whole lot of, well, that was something. I don't know. I wouldn't exactly call it a traditional. I wouldn't usually call it a traditional antitrust trial. It was, I don't want to say shakedown. I don't want to say that, but if it wasn't a shakedown of Bill Gates, it would do until a shakedown showed up, So, and don't get me wrong, Microsoft was, and again, to your point, people forget this, who are not of our particular age, who are particularly younger, who might be listening to this podcast. Microsoft was the dragon for a long time. They were the dragon in the cave. And so, and Apple did its fair job of trying to fight that dragon. And so there you go.
Yep.
Well, we're wrapping up here, rounding the corner. What would you like to leave us with today? What can leaders take from the power of the powerless? Libby, what can they take from reading this essay by Vaclav Havel?
Great hope in the power of the individual. It did take them 40 years, actually 50 years, to break down the ideological dictatorship that took over Czechoslovakia. But it did happen.
Yes.
Stay true to leading a principled life. Stay true to creating to yourself as a creator and community member. And have faith, but be vigilant. Continue to adapt, learn, and solve problems. And you will be the future leader, changing the planet to move up and to the right.
I can't think of a better way to top that. So I'd like to thank my guest today, Libby Unger. I'd like to thank her for showing up here today on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. And with that, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.